She thought losing 10 minutes would cost her everything, but she had no idea it would change her life instead. The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the cracked windshield of Emily Carter's aging Honda like a clock she couldn't silence, each drop another second slipping away as the dashboard read 8:57 a.m. and her shift started at 9 o'clock sharp. No exceptions, no excuses, not anymore, not after the last warning her manager had sent in bold capital letters the night before, and in the back seat, her 4-year-old son Liam's backpack lay half-zipped with a small dinosaur toy peeking out as if watching her panic unfold. "Mom, are you gonna be late again?" His voice echoed in her mind from earlier that morning, soft but heavy, the kind of question no child should need to ask, and Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, whispering under her breath, "Not today, please not today," as she turned onto Maple Avenue, already calculating the exact minutes it would take to park, clock in, and pretend she wasn't drowning, because this job wasn't just a job. It was rent, groceries, Liam's preschool tuition, it was survival, and then, just ahead, something broke the rhythm of her thoughts. A car angled strangely at the curb, its hazard lights blinking in uneven pulses, and a man standing, or trying to, near the driver's side, one hand pressed against the door, the other gripping his side as if the world had tilted beneath him. Emily's foot hovered over the gas pedal, instinct pulling her forward, urgency screaming that she couldn't stop, not now. Not when everything was already hanging by a thread, but something else. Quieter, steadier, pushed back, and she slowed, her heart thudding louder than the rain as she pulled over, the engine still running, the clock now 8:59, 1 minute left, one decision, and she stepped out into the cold morning air, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles as she approached him cautiously. "Sir, are you okay?" She called out, her voice cutting through the rain, and the man looked up, his expression strained but composed, the kind of composure that didn't belong on a sidewalk in the middle of nowhere. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him, quieter than it should have been, and Emily didn't believe him for a second, not with the way his hand trembled slightly against the car door, not with the faint crease of pain between his brows. "You don't look fine," she replied gently, stepping closer, already pulling off her light jacket without thinking, draping it over his shoulders despite the chill biting at her own skin. "Let me call someone," she added, reaching for her phone, and for a brief moment, she glanced back at her car, at the ticking clock she could almost hear even from here, and in that single glance lived everything she stood to lose. But when she turned back, meeting the man's eyes, steady, searching, unexpectedly grateful, she made her choice without another word. The man exhaled slowly as Emily held the phone to her ear, her fingers slightly numb from the cold, but steady, always steady, because she did not have the luxury of falling apart. "Not here, not now, 911, what is your emergency?" The voice on the other end asked, calm and distant, and Emily glanced at the man again, taking in the details she had missed before, the tailored coat now damp from the rain, the polished shoes standing in a shallow puddle, the quiet strength in the way he held himself despite whatever was weighing on him. "There is a man who needs help," she said clearly, giving the location, her voice firm even as her heartbeat refused to slow, and when she hung up, she noticed his gaze had not left her, not once, as if he was trying to understand something beyond the moment. "You did not have to stop," he said, his tone softer now, almost curious, and Emily let out a small breath, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. "Yeah, I did," she replied, not as a statement of heroism, but as something simpler, something unshakable, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence between them, steady and constant, until he shifted slightly, wincing just enough for her to notice. "Hey, do not move too much," she said quickly, stepping closer, instinctively placing a hand near his arm. "Not touching, just ready, help is coming," she added, and he gave a faint nod, though his eyes flickered with something else, something unreadable. "What is your name?" he asked after a pause, and Emily hesitated, just for a second, because names made things real, made connections linger longer than they should. "Emily," she said finally, and he repeated it quietly, as if committing it to memory. "Emily," then after a breath, "Daniel," and the name settled between them, simple, ordinary, yet it did not feel ordinary in the way he said it, like it carried weight she could not see, and somewhere in the distance, a siren began to echo faintly, growing louder with each passing second, and Emily felt a strange mix of relief and urgency. Relief that help was close, urgency because time had already slipped too far from her grasp, and her mind flashed back to the digital clock in her car, to the message waiting on her phone, to the reality she had paused but not escaped, and she swallowed hard, glancing toward the street as the ambulance came into view, lights cutting through the gray morning. "They are here," she said softly, almost to herself, and as the vehicle pulled up, 2 responders stepped out with calm efficiency, moving toward them with practiced focus, asking questions, assessing quickly, and Emily stepped back just enough to give them space, her hands falling to her sides, now empty, now unsure what to do next, and Daniel turned his head slightly toward her as they began to guide him carefully, his expression steadier now, but his eyes still locked on hers. "You should not be late because of me," he said quietly, and something about that sentence hit deeper than it should have, because it was exactly what she had been thinking, exactly what she had been trying not to think about. And she let out a small, almost humorless breath. "Too late for that," she murmured, more to herself than to him, and one of the responders asked her a question about what she had seen, what had happened, and she answered quickly, efficiently, the way people do when they cannot afford to linger, and when she finally stepped away, the rain felt colder somehow, heavier, as she turned back toward her car, her shoes soaking through, her chest tight, not from fear, but from the quiet realization settling in, that the moment she chose to stop had already rewritten the rest of her day, maybe more than just her day, and as she reached for the car door, she heard his voice one last time behind her, faint but clear, "Emily," and she turned, just slightly, enough to meet his gaze again, and he gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just a simple acknowledgement that somehow felt bigger than words, and then the door of the ambulance closed, sealing the moment, leaving her alone with the rain, the ticking clock, and the consequences waiting just ahead. The engine coughed twice before finally turning over, a tired mechanical sound that matched exactly how Emily felt as she slid into the driver's seat, her hands still damp and slightly trembling as they wrapped around the steering wheel, and for a brief second she just sat there, staring at the blinking dashboard clock now reading 9:17 a.m., 17 minutes late, not 5, not 10, but 17, a number that felt final. Like a door already closed before she even had the chance to knock, and she let out a slow breath, pressing her forehead lightly against the wheel, the faint smell of rain and worn fabric grounding her back into reality. Okay, she whispered to herself, forcing her fingers to move, to shift the car into drive, because stopping had already cost her something and standing still now would cost her everything else, and the streets blurred slightly as she drove faster than usual, not reckless, just desperate. Her mind racing ahead of her, replaying the message from her manager, the sharp tone, the lack of patience, the unspoken understanding that she was already one mistake away from being replaced, and maybe this was that mistake, maybe this was the moment everything slipped out of her hands, and yet, beneath the fear, something quieter remained, something steady that refused to regret what she had done, not completely, not even now, because she could still see his face, the way he had looked at her, not like she was invisible, not like she was just another person passing by, and that alone felt different enough to linger, but the thought faded quickly as the familiar gray building of Carter Logistics came into view, its glass doors reflecting the overcast sky, indifferent and unchanging as always, and Emily parked hastily, barely noticing the rain still falling as she grabbed her bag and rushed inside, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The fluorescent lights above too bright, too harsh, making everything feel even more exposed, and as she approached the front desk, she could feel the shift immediately, the subtle glances, the quiet awareness, the kind that spread faster than words, and her stomach tightened as she walked toward the office hallway, each step heavier than the last, until she reached the door she had entered every morning for the past 2 years, except today it felt different, colder, like it no longer belonged to her, and she barely had time to take a breath before a voice cut through the air, sharp and precise, "Emily, my office now," and she turned to see Mr. Thompson standing by his door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his tone already saying enough, and without a word, she nodded and followed, closing the door behind her as the outside noise disappeared into silence, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the ticking wall clock filling the space like a countdown she could not escape, and then he exhaled slowly, shaking his head just once, "Do you know what time it is?" he asked, though they both already knew, and Emily swallowed, standing straighter despite the weight pressing down on her chest. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady even if everything else was not, and he glanced at his watch as if confirming something, then back at her. 17 minutes late, he repeated, each word deliberate, final, and she opened her mouth, ready to explain, to tell him about the man, about the ambulance, about the choice she had made, but something in his expression stopped her. Something that made it clear explanations would not matter here, not in this room, not in this moment, and the silence stretched just long enough for her to understand exactly what was coming next. Emily held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than she needed to, just long enough to confirm what she already knew, that this was not a conversation, it was a conclusion, and Mr. Thompson straightened slightly behind his desk, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with a small, practiced motion that felt almost rehearsed, like he had done this many times before. "We have policies for a reason," he began, his voice even, controlled, not angry, not emotional, just firm in a way that left no space for negotiation, and Emily nodded once, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, not in defiance, but in quiet preparation. "I understand," she said, though the words felt heavier than usual, because understanding did not make it easier, and he exhaled again, glancing briefly toward the window before returning his attention to her. "You have been warned before," he continued, and there it was, the past brought forward like evidence, not exaggerated, not unfair, just enough to justify what came next. And Emily felt it settle over her like a weight she had been carrying long before this morning, the missed bus last month, the day Liam had been sick, the moments where life had not aligned neatly with expectations, and she could feel the explanation rising again, pushing against her chest, the image of the man in the rain, the ambulance, the choice she had made, and this time she did not stop it. "There was an accident," she said, her voice calm but quieter now, more personal. "A man needed help, and no one stopped," and for the first time, something shifted in Mr. Thompson's expression. Not sympathy, not quite, but a flicker of something human. Something that almost asked a question, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced again by policy, by structure, by the invisible rules that kept everything in place. "And I respect that," he said after a pause, and for a second, the words almost sounded sincere. "But this is a business, Emily," he added, and there it was again, the line that separated intention from consequence. The quiet reminder that the world did not always reward the right choices. "We cannot operate on exceptions," he finished, and the room fell silent again, the ticking clock louder now, each second sealing what had already been decided, and Emily swallowed slowly, feeling the truth of it settle in, not because she agreed, but because she understood how little her agreement mattered here. And when he reached for the folder on his desk, sliding a single sheet of paper toward her, she did not hesitate, did not argue, did not raise her voice, because somewhere between the rain and this moment, she had already accepted the cost, and she stepped forward, her movement steady, almost detached, taking the paper without looking at it right away, because she did not need to read it to know what it said. "I am sorry it ends this way," Mr. Thompson added, and whether he meant it or not no longer mattered, because Emily gave a small nod, her expression calm in a way that surprised even herself. "So am I," she replied softly, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not as manager and employee, but as two people standing on opposite sides of a decision neither of them could change. And then she turned, opening the door without another word, stepping back into the bright, indifferent hallway, where everything looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago, except now it was not hers anymore. And as she walked past the rows of desks, past the co-workers who suddenly found reasons to look away, past the life she had carefully built piece by piece, she felt the absence before she even reached the exit, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, hollow space where certainty used to be. And when she finally pushed open the glass doors, the rain had not stopped, as if the world had decided to stay exactly as it was, even when hers had just changed completely. The rain felt different now, colder somehow, as Emily stepped onto the sidewalk with nothing in her hands except her bag and the folded paper she had not read yet, her breath slow and controlled even as her thoughts moved faster than she could catch them, because losing a job was not just about losing a paycheck, it was about everything tied to it, the rent due in 12 days, the grocery list already stretched thin, The preschool bill she had been planning to pay on Friday, and she stood there for a moment under the gray sky, not moving, not rushing, just letting the reality settle in piece by piece, until a passing car splashed water near her shoes and pulled her back, reminding her that the world had not paused with her, that it never did, and she finally exhaled, unfolding the paper in her hand just enough to glance at it, the words exactly what she expected, formal, impersonal, final, and she folded it again without finishing, slipping it back into her bag like something she could deal with later, something she had to carry but did not have to face all at once, and as she walked toward her car, each step felt heavier than before, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet weight of what came next, the conversations she would have to have, the explanations she would need to give, especially to Liam, who was too young to understand layoffs or policies or why doing the right thing sometimes came with consequences, and she paused by the driver door, her reflection faint in the rain-speckled window, her eyes searching her own face as if trying to find something steady to hold on to, and after a moment, she nodded once to herself, a small, almost invisible gesture, but enough, because she had made harder choices before, she had started over before, and she could do it again, even if she did not yet know how, and as she opened the car door and slid inside, the familiar creak of the seat grounding her, she reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating just slightly before unlocking the screen. And there it was, a missed call from the daycare, followed by a voicemail notification, and her heart tightened instantly, not with panic, but with that constant low-level worry that never quite left, and she pressed play, holding the phone close as the gentle voice of Mrs. Turner came through. "Hi Emily, just wanted to let you know Liam is doing fine. He asked about you earlier, said you looked tired this morning, so we made sure he got extra snack time," and Emily let out a breath she did not realize she was holding, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, because even small reassurances mattered now more than ever, and when the message ended, she stayed still for a second longer, staring at the dashboard, at the faint outline of the street beyond the windshield, and then she whispered softly, almost like a promise, "I have got you," not to anyone who could hear, but to the one person who needed her to keep going no matter what, and she started the engine again, the sound steady, familiar, and as she pulled away from the curb, merging back into the slow flow of traffic, she did not notice the black SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows hiding the quiet observation inside, or the man seated in the back, watching her car disappear into the distance, his expression thoughtful, his hand resting lightly against the seat as if grounding himself in something more than the moment, and for the first time since the morning began, something shifted, not in Emily's world yet, but in the one she had unknowingly stepped into, a world where choices like hers did not go unseen, and where consequences did not always end the way they began. The apartment felt smaller that afternoon, not because anything had changed, but because everything had, the quiet hum of the refrigerator louder than usual, the faint ticking of the wall clock stretching each second into something she could feel, and Emily moved slowly through the space, setting her bag down on the worn kitchen counter before leaning both hands against it, her head lowering just slightly as if the weight of the day had finally found a place to land, and for a moment she let herself stand there without pretending, without calculating the next step, without forcing a solution that did not yet exist, because sometimes the hardest part was simply pausing long enough to admit that things were not okay, and then she straightened, inhaling deeply, pushing the moment aside the way she always did, because Liam would be home soon, and when he walked through that door, he would not need uncertainty, he would need her, steady, present, unshaken, and she reached for a glass. Filling it with tap water, taking a slow sip as her mind began moving again, not in panic, but in quiet planning, the way it always had, part-time work, maybe a second shift somewhere, calling the landlord, adjusting the budget, stretching what little she had just a bit further, and she almost laughed softly to herself, not out of humor, but out of recognition, because this was not new. This was just another version of the same challenge she had been facing for years, and she had always found a way through, even when it did not seem possible at the time, and the sound of small footsteps in the hallway outside broke her thoughts, followed by the familiar knock she knew by heart, 2 quick taps, a pause, then one more, and Emily moved immediately, opening the door to find Liam standing there with his small backpack hanging unevenly from one shoulder, his cheeks slightly flushed from the cool air, and when he looked up at her, his expression brightened instantly. "Mom," he said, stepping inside as if nothing in the world had changed, and she knelt down to his level, pulling him gently into her arms, holding him just a second longer than usual, grounding herself in something that still made sense. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, and he pulled back just enough to study her face, his small brows furrowing slightly. "You look tired," he said honestly, and Emily smiled faintly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Long day," she replied simply, because some truths were easier than others, and he nodded as if that explained everything. Already moving on, already unburdened in the way children often are, and as he walked toward the small table, pulling out a chair and beginning to unpack his bag with quiet concentration, Emily watched him for a moment, noticing the way he carefully lined up his crayons, the way he hummed softly to himself, completely unaware of the numbers running through her head, the bills, the deadlines, the uncertainty waiting just beyond this room, and yet, somehow, his calm steadied her, reminded her that even in the middle of everything shifting, there were still things she could hold on to, and she moved toward the stove, turning it on, beginning to prepare something simple for dinner, her movements automatic, practiced, and for a brief moment, the rhythm of it all, the familiar sounds, the quiet presence of her son, made the day feel almost distant, like something that had already passed, and maybe in some ways it had, because whatever came next would not be decided by what she had lost, but by what she chose to do now. And as she stirred the pot gently, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the rain had finally begun to slow, the steady downpour softening into something lighter, almost hesitant, as if even the sky was beginning to let go, one drop at a time. That night, after Liam had fallen asleep with one small hand still resting on the edge of his blanket, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table with only a dim overhead light casting soft shadows across the worn surface, her phone placed face down in front of her like something she was not quite ready to face, and the quiet of the apartment felt deeper now, not empty, but reflective, as if every sound had slowed down just enough for her thoughts to catch up, and she leaned back slightly in the chair, exhaling as she finally reached for the folded paper from her bag, smoothing it out carefully, reading each line this time, not because she needed confirmation, but because seeing it in full made it real in a way she could not ignore, and when she finished, she did not react immediately, did not let the emotion rise all at once. Instead she folded it again with the same precision, placing it neatly beside her phone, as if controlling the small things might help her manage the larger ones. And for a while she simply sat there, her fingers lightly tapping against the table, not impatiently, just thinking, calculating, adjusting, because this was what she did, this was how she survived, one decision at a time, and her eyes drifted toward the small stack of unopened mail near the corner, the envelopes marked with dates and quiet urgency, and she reached for them, sorting through each one slowly, rent, utilities, preschool, the numbers adding themselves together in her mind without needing to be written down, and she paused when she reached the last envelope, thinner than the others, unfamiliar, with no return address she recognized, and she hesitated for a moment before opening it, sliding the paper out carefully, her brow furrowing slightly as she scanned the contents. A formal letter, but not from a company she knew, the name printed at the top clear and unfamiliar, Hayes Industries, and she read it again, more carefully this time, her heartbeat shifting just slightly as the words settled in, an invitation, not vague, not uncertain, but direct, requesting her presence for a meeting the following morning at 10 o'clock, with a contact number listed below, and for a moment she simply stared at it, her mind trying to connect something that did not yet make sense, because she had never applied there, never reached out, never had any reason to expect something like this, and yet the timing felt too precise to ignore, too closely tied to the day she had just lived through, and she leaned back again, the paper still in her hands, her thoughts circling quietly, not jumping to conclusions, but not dismissing it either, and after a moment she reached for her phone, turning it over, her thumb hovering just slightly before unlocking it, scrolling through her recent activity, her calls, her messages, looking for something she might have missed, something that explained this, but there was nothing, just the same notifications, the same reminders, the same unanswered questions, and she let out a slow breath, setting the phone down again as her gaze returned to the letter, the clean, deliberate font, the address printed clearly at the bottom, downtown, a place far removed from her usual routine, and she pressed her lips together thoughtfully, because this was unexpected, uncertain, and maybe even risky. But it was also something else, something she could not ignore, a possibility. And she had learned long ago that sometimes the smallest openings came from the most unlikely moments, and as she folded the letter once more, placing it carefully beside the others, she made a quiet decision, not out loud, not dramatic, just steady and certain, that she would go, not because she expected anything, but because not going would leave her with something far heavier than uncertainty. And as she turned off the light and moved toward her room, the apartment falling into darkness. Behind her, the future felt just as unclear as it had an hour ago, but for the first time since the morning began, it did not feel completely closed. The next morning arrived quieter than she expected, the kind of calm that felt almost fragile, as if the world had paused just long enough to see what she would do next, and Emily stood in front of the small mirror near the door, smoothing down the front of her only blazer, the fabric slightly worn at the sleeves but still neat, still presentable, and she adjusted it once more before stepping back, her eyes studying her reflection not with doubt, but with quiet determination, because she did not need perfection, she just needed to show up, and behind her, Liam sat at the table finishing his breakfast, his small legs swinging lightly under the chair, unaware of the weight carried in the room. "Are you going to work today?" he asked, his voice casual, curious, and Emily paused just briefly before turning toward him, her expression softening. "Something like that," she replied gently, because the truth was not something he needed all at once, not yet, and he nodded as if satisfied, returning to his cereal without another question, trusting her the way children do, completely and without hesitation. And that trust settled into her chest like something solid, something she could carry with her, and after dropping him off at daycare with a promise to pick him up later, she drove downtown, the buildings rising taller with each block, the streets busier, more structured, more distant from the world she moved through every day, and when she finally pulled up in front of Hayes Industries, she hesitated for just a moment, her hand resting on the steering wheel as she took in the glass exterior stretching high above her, reflecting the clear morning sky, everything about it polished, deliberate, untouchable, and she stepped out of the car, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement as she made her way toward the entrance, each step steady even if her thoughts were not, and inside, the lobby was quiet in a different way than her apartment had been, not empty, but controlled, voices low, movements precise, the kind of place where everything seemed to function without visible effort, and she approached the front desk, offering a small, polite smile. "Hi, I have a meeting scheduled," she said, her voice calm despite the unfamiliar surroundings, and the receptionist glanced at her screen before nodding, her expression shifting slightly, not dismissive, not surprised, just attentive in a way that felt intentional. "Yes, Ms. Carter, we have been expecting you," she replied, her tone professional but warmer than Emily anticipated, and she gestured toward the elevators. "You can take that up to the 32nd floor, someone will meet you there," and Emily nodded, offering a quiet thank you before turning toward the elevators, her reflection briefly visible in the polished metal doors as they opened, and as she stepped inside, the space felt enclosed but not uncomfortable, just still, just focused, and when the doors closed, she exhaled slowly, her fingers lightly brushing against the strap of her bag as the numbers began to rise, each floor bringing her closer to something she did not fully understand yet, and when the elevator finally stopped and the doors slid open, she stepped out into a quieter hallway, softer lighting, fewer people, the atmosphere shifting subtly as if this level operated on a different rhythm entirely, and before she could take more than a few steps, a man in a dark suit approached her with a calm, measured expression. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady, "this way, please," and Emily nodded once, following without question, her heart beginning to beat just a little faster now, not from fear, but from the growing sense that this moment, whatever it was not random, not accidental, and as they reached a set of double doors at the end of the hall, the man paused, placing a hand lightly on one of them before glancing back at her. "He has been waiting for you," he said simply, and for a brief second, Emily felt time slow just enough for the weight of that sentence to settle in, before the door opened, and everything shifted again. The room was larger than she expected, but it was not the size that made Emily pause, it was the stillness, the kind that felt intentional, controlled, as if every detail inside had been placed with purpose, and at the far end, near a wide window overlooking the city, stood the man she had not stopped thinking about since the rain, his posture straight, composed, no trace of the strain she had seen the day before, and for a brief second, her mind tried to reconcile the two images, the man leaning against a car in the storm and the one standing here now, calm, collected, completely in control, and when he turned to face her fully, there was no doubt left. "Daniel," she said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, as if hearing his name from her carried a different weight. "Emily," he replied, his voice steady, familiar in a way that felt out of place in this polished space, and the man who had led her in stepped back silently, closing the door behind them, leaving only the two of them in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than before, and for a moment neither of them moved, the air between them filled with everything unsaid, everything that had led to this point, until Daniel took a step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. "I was not sure you would come," he admitted, and Emily let out a small breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the strap of her bag, grounding herself in something simple. "I almost did not," she said honestly, because there had been a moment, sitting at that kitchen table, when uncertainty had nearly outweighed curiosity, but she had come anyway, and now standing here, she understood why, and Daniel nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something for him, something he had already suspected, and he gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit," he said, his tone polite but carrying an underlying authority that did not need to be stated, and Emily hesitated for only a second before taking the seat, her posture straight, her gaze steady, not intimidated, but aware, because everything about this place reminded her that she did not belong here, not yet, and Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, his eyes studying her with a quiet intensity that was not uncomfortable, just focused, as if he was looking for something specific, and finally he spoke again. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, and Emily paused, not because she did not recognize him, but because she wanted to answer carefully. "Honestly, you are the man I helped yesterday," she said, her voice calm, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his expression, brief but genuine. "That is true," he replied, "but it is not the whole truth," and he moved behind the desk then, resting his hands lightly against its surface. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he continued, "I am the chief executive officer of this company," and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a fact stated plainly, and Emily felt the shift immediately, not in him, but in the context of everything that had happened, the rain, the accident, the black SUV she had not noticed, the letter she had received, all of it aligning in a way that was too precise to ignore, and she exhaled slowly, her gaze steady on him. "I see," she said, because there was nothing else to say in that moment that would not feel unnecessary, and Daniel watched her closely, as if expecting surprise, disbelief, something more, but when it did not come, something else appeared in his expression instead, something closer to respect. "You are not surprised," he observed, and Emily shook her head slightly. "I am," she replied, "just not in the way you think," and that seemed to interest him more than anything else she could have said, because he leaned forward just slightly, his attention sharpening, as if whatever came next mattered far more than the introduction that had just changed everything. Daniel did not look away as she spoke, and for a moment the room held a quiet tension that was not uncomfortable, but intentional, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would define everything that followed, and he straightened slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. "Then tell me," he said, his voice calm but focused, "what way is that?" And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not defensive, just steady in a way that came from knowing exactly why she had made the choices she did. "I am not surprised that you are important," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "I am surprised that it matters now," and that answer seemed to land differently than anything else, because Daniel's expression shifted again, more thoughtful this time, less controlled, as if her perspective had reached a place he had not expected, and he moved around the desk, not to assert authority, but to close the distance slightly, making the space between them feel less formal. "It matters," he said, not firmly, but deliberately, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was not used to explaining himself, not like this, not to someone like her, and Emily tilted her head just slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Why?" she asked, not out of doubt, but out of clarity, because she needed to understand what this was before she allowed herself to believe it could be anything more, and Daniel paused, just for a second, as if weighing the simplest version of the truth against the one he usually gave, the one that sounded better, more structured, more expected, and then he chose differently, because you did not know who I was, he said, his voice quieter now, but more real, and Emily did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she understood exactly what he meant, and he continued, his gaze steady on her. Everyone around me knows exactly who I am, what I represent, what I can give them, and they act accordingly, he explained, not with frustration, but with a kind of quiet awareness that had likely been building for years. You did not, he added, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any explanation could, and Emily let out a small breath, her fingers brushing lightly against each other as she considered it. I saw someone who needed help, she said, her tone unchanged, because to her, it really had been that simple, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to realize. Exactly, he replied, and for a moment, silence settled between them again, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, but aligned, as if they were both standing in the same understanding, even if they had arrived there from completely different places. And then Daniel reached for a folder on the desk, sliding it toward her with a controlled motion. I reviewed your file, he said, returning to a more structured tone, though the underlying sincerity remained. Your performance, your attendance, your evaluations, he continued, and Emily felt a slight tension return at those words, not fear, but awareness, because she knew what that file would show, the consistency, the effort, and the small inconsistencies that came with a life that did not always cooperate, and she did not reach for the folder right away, her gaze remaining on him instead, and, she asked quietly, and Daniel's expression softened just slightly again, and I saw someone who has been doing everything she can to keep going, even when it is not easy, he said, and this time there was no distance in his voice, no formality, just observation, and Emily felt something shift at that, not externally, but inside, because being seen like that, without judgment, without dismissal, was something she had not expected, especially not here, and Daniel rested his hand lightly against the desk again, his posture steady. You lost your job yesterday because of a decision you made in less than 60 seconds, he continued, a decision most people would not have made, and he paused, letting that settle before adding, I do not consider that a weakness, and the room fell quiet again, but this time the silence carried something new, something that felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something she had not yet fully understood. Emily did not reach for the folder right away, even as it rested within her reach, because something about this moment felt less like a transaction and more like a test of something she had not yet defined, and she looked at Daniel instead, her expression thoughtful, grounded. Then why am I here? She asked, her voice calm but direct. Not out of doubt, but out of a need for clarity, because she had learned long ago that assumptions could cost more than they gave, and Daniel held her gaze for a second longer before answering, as if he respected the question enough to consider it fully. Because I do not believe you should have lost your job for that decision, he said, his tone steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just certain, and Emily exhaled softly, her fingers finally moving to rest lightly against the edge of the folder, not opening it yet, just acknowledging its presence. That is not something you control, she replied quietly, because the reality of what had already happened still stood unchanged, and Daniel nodded once, not disagreeing, but not stepping back either. No, he admitted, but what happens next is, and that statement settled differently, not as a promise, but as an opening, and Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharpening just enough to show that she was listening more closely. Now, go on, she said, and Daniel stepped back toward the desk, not creating distance, but shifting into something more structured, something that carried both intention and direction. I built this company on efficiency, precision, results, he began, his voice taking on a measured rhythm, the kind that came from years of leadership, but somewhere along the way, something was lost, he continued, and there was a brief pause there, not for effect, but because the truth required it. People stopped being seen beyond what they produced, he added, and Emily felt that land in a way she could not ignore, because she had lived that reality, not just yesterday, but long before it, and Daniel rested his hand lightly against the back of the chair across from her, his posture relaxed but intentional. What you did yesterday, he said, returning to the moment that had brought them here, was not efficient. It was not calculated, and it certainly was not convenient, and there was the faintest hint of something in his expression, not humor, but recognition, but it was right, he finished, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any justification could, and Emily lowered her gaze briefly, not out of discomfort, but to steady the shift happening inside her, because hearing that from someone in his position felt unfamiliar, almost unexpected, and when she looked back up. Her voice was quieter, but no less firm. Doing the right thing does not always pay the bills, she said, not as a challenge, but as a reality she could not ignore, and Daniel nodded immediately, as if he had been waiting for that exact response. I know, he said, and for the first time, there was something more personal in his tone, something less practiced. That is why I am not offering you a thank you, he added, and Emily's brow furrowed slightly at that, her attention sharpening, because this was no longer about recognition, it was about something else entirely, and Daniel reached forward, gently pushing the folder closer to her. I am offering you a position, he said, his voice calm, deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and for a moment, the room felt completely still, as if even the air had paused to let the meaning settle in, and Emily looked down at the folder again. This time not as something to avoid, but as something that might change everything, and she hesitated, not because she did not understand what he was saying, but because she needed to decide what it meant for her, not just in this room, but beyond it, in the life she would walk back into the moment she left. Emily did not open the folder immediately, her fingers resting lightly on its edge as if she needed to feel its weight before understanding its meaning, and she looked up at Daniel again, her expression calm but more guarded now, because offers like this did not come without expectations, not in her world, not in his. What kind of position? She asked, her voice steady, not hesitant, just careful, and Daniel seemed to expect that, his posture shifting slightly as he leaned back against the desk, giving her space, not pressure. A role in operations, he replied, his tone measured, one that requires attention to detail, consistency, and the ability to make decisions when it matters, and Emily let out a small breath, her gaze dropping briefly to the folder before returning to him. You already have people for that, she said quietly, because she had just left a company where people were easily replaced, and she did not assume she was any different here, and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. I do, he said, but not all of them would have made the choice you did yesterday, and there it was again, not praise, not exaggeration, just a simple distinction that set her apart in a way she was not used to, and Emily finally opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents, the printed details clear, structured, real, the position title, the responsibilities, the compensation, and she paused slightly at that last part, not because she doubted it, but because it was more than she had expected, more than she had planned for, and for a moment, the room felt quieter again, her thoughts moving carefully through what this meant, not just for her, but for Liam, for their apartment, for the life she had been trying to hold together one piece at a time, and she closed the folder gently, placing it back on the desk with a controlled motion, not rejecting it, not accepting it yet, just holding the moment where it was. Why me? She asked again, softer this time, not because she had not heard his earlier answer, but because she needed to understand the part he had not said, the part that mattered beyond a single moment in the rain, and Daniel watched her closely, his expression steady but more open now, as if he had already decided to be honest with her. Because you remind me of something I built this company without, he said, and she held his gaze, waiting, and he continued, perspective, and that word landed differently, not as a compliment, but as a truth, something he recognized as missing. Something he saw in her, and Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the strap of her bag, grounding herself again, because this was not just about a job, it was about stepping into a world that operated differently than anything she had known, and she exhaled slowly, her voice quiet but certain. And what happens when I do not fit into that world? She asked, because that was the question that mattered most, not the offer itself, but what came after, and Daniel did not hesitate this time. Then we adjust the world, he said, simply, not as a promise made lightly, but as a statement of intent, and for a moment, Emily felt something shift again, not just opportunity, but possibility, the kind that did not erase what had happened, but changed what could come next, and she looked down at the folder one more time, then back at him, her decision forming not in a rush, but in a steady, deliberate way that matched everything she had done since the moment she stepped out into the rain, and this time, when she spoke, there was no hesitation at all. Emily held his gaze for a long second, not searching for reassurance, not looking for certainty, but simply grounding herself in the truth of the moment, because everything that had happened since the rain had led here, not by chance, but by choice, and she slowly reached for the folder again, opening it with steady hands, her eyes scanning the details one more time, not to question them, but to accept what they represented. And when she closed it again, there was a quiet clarity in her expression that had not been there before. "I will take the position," she said, her voice calm, even, not rushed, not overwhelmed, just certain, and Daniel nodded once, not surprised, not triumphant, just acknowledging the decision with the same measured respect he had shown from the beginning. "Good," he replied simply, because there was no need for anything more, and for a moment, the room settled into a quiet understanding, not the kind that ended a conversation, but the kind that began something new. And Emily stood, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer almost instinctively, as if preparing herself to step into a role she had not imagined 24 hours ago, and Daniel moved toward the desk, pressing a button lightly, his tone returning to its structured cadence. "I will have someone assist you with the onboarding process," he said, already transitioning from decision to action, and Emily nodded. But before she turned, she paused, her hand resting briefly against the back of the chair. "I did not help you because of this," she said, not as a disclaimer, but as something she needed him to understand clearly, and Daniel met her gaze again, his expression steady. "I know," he said, and this time there was no distance in his voice at all, only recognition, and that was enough, more than enough, because it meant the moment that had started everything remained untouched, unchanged by what came after. And Emily gave a small nod before turning toward the door, her steps steady as she moved forward, not away from what had happened, but into what came next. And when the door opened and she stepped back into the hallway, the light felt the same, the space unchanged, but something in her had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that settled deeper, more lasting, because for the first time in a long time, she was not just reacting to what life placed in front of her, she was stepping into something she had chosen. And as she followed the assistant down the hall, listening as they explained the next steps, the details, the structure, her thoughts drifted briefly to Liam, to the small apartment, to the kitchen table where she had sat the night before with uncertainty pressing in from every side, and she could almost see that version of herself still sitting there, holding that letter, unsure of what it meant, and she allowed herself a small, quiet breath, not relief exactly, but something close to it. Because the path ahead would not be easy, she understood that already. New environments never were, but it was a path that had opened because of who she was, not in spite of it, and as the elevator doors closed behind her once more, beginning their descent back toward the street, the city waiting below, she realized something she had not fully put into words until now, that the 10 minutes she thought had cost her everything had in fact revealed something far more valuable, something no job could take away. And as she stepped out into the morning light, the sky clearer now, the rain completely gone, her phone buzzed softly in her bag, a simple message from the daycare, a photo of Liam smiling with a crayon in his hand, and Emily looked at it for a second longer than necessary, her lips curving into the faintest smile, because in the end, it had never been about losing or gaining, it had been about choosing, and that morning, she had chosen to stop, to help, to care, and somehow, that choice had found its way back to her, not as a reward, but as a reminder that kindness, even when it costs you something, is never truly lost.